The dust hadn't even settled from the train's arrival when Eleanor Vance felt her courage begin to crack like the parched earth beneath her worn boots. She stood on the platform in Stillwater, Oklahoma, clutching a carpetbag that held everything she owned and a letter that had changed her life 3 months ago. The August heat of 1883 pressed down on her shoulders like an invisible weight, and the sun glinted off the railroad tracks with such intensity that she had to squint to see the small crowd gathered at the station. Women in simple calico dresses whispered behind their hands, and men in dusty work clothes stared with undisguised curiosity at the newcomer. Eleanor knew what they saw. A plain woman of 22 with mousy brown hair pulled back in a severe bun, a faded gray traveling dress that had seen better days, and eyes that couldn't quite meet anyone's gaze. She had corresponded with Kenneth Owens for 6 months, each letter more hopeful than the last. But now that she stood in his town, breathing his air, she felt certain he would take one look at her and realize he had made a terrible mistake. The photograph she had sent him was flattering, taken 3 years ago when her mother was still alive, and there had been enough money for such luxuries. The woman in that photograph had softer features, fuller cheeks, and eyes that still believed in happiness. The woman who stood on this platform was hollowed out by grief and hardship, aged beyond her years by the struggle to survive in Boston after her mother's death. When the landlord had finally evicted her from their tiny room above the bakery, she had found Kenneth's advertisement in the newspaper, almost by accident. Rancher in Oklahoma Territory seeks honest, hardworking wife. Must be of good character and willing to embrace frontier life. She had written to him that very night, her hands shaking as she penned lies about her domestic skills and optimistic statements about her pioneer spirit. The truth was that she could barely cook, had never seen a cow up close, and was terrified of wide open spaces. But she had nowhere else to go, and Kenneth Owens had seemed kind in his letters. Now, as the other passengers dispersed and the platform began to empty, Eleanor wondered if he had changed his mind. Perhaps he had seen her step off the train and immediately retreated, already composing the words that would send her back east. She had no money for a return ticket. She had spent her last dollars on the journey here. If Kenneth Owens rejected her, she would be stranded in this dusty Oklahoma town with no prospects and no hope. Her throat tightened with unshed tears, and she forced herself to take a deep breath. She would not cry in front of these strangers. She had promised herself that much. "Miss Vance." The voice came from behind her, deep and warm like honey in tea. Eleanor turned slowly, bracing herself for disappointment, and found herself looking up into the most remarkable pair of gray eyes she had ever seen. The man who stood before her was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that strained against a clean white shirt. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though he wasn't smiling now. He held his hat in his hands, his dark hair slightly mussed, and he was staring at her with an intensity that made her want to look away. But she forced herself to meet his gaze, to let him see her clearly in the harsh afternoon light. This was Kenneth Owens, her intended husband, the man who was about to send her away. "Yes," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Eleanor Vance." For a long moment he said nothing. His gray eyes searched her face, traveling from her eyes to her lips and back again. Eleanor felt her cheeks burn with shame. She knew what he was thinking. She wasn't what he expected. She wasn't pretty enough, young enough, healthy enough. She was a disappointment, and now he would have to figure out how to let her down gently. "I've been waiting my whole life," Kenneth said softly, and there was something in his voice that made Eleanor's breath catch. I didn't know it until I got your first letter, but I've been waiting for you. Eleanor blinked, certain she had misheard. I'm sorry, what? Kenneth took a step closer, and she caught the scent of sage and leather and something else, something clean and masculine that made her pulse quicken. I know this is strange, he said, and now there was a hint of nervousness in his voice, as though he was the one who feared rejection. I know we've only exchanged letters and you probably think I'm crazy, but when I saw you step off that train, I knew. I just knew. Knew what? Eleanor asked, confusion making her bold. That you were the one I've been looking for. He reached out as if to touch her arm, then seemed to think better of it and let his hand fall back to his side. I'm not explaining this well. Let me try again. Miss Vance, Eleanor, I want you to know that you're even more beautiful than your photograph. And I'm grateful, so grateful that you came all this way to give us a chance. Eleanor felt the world tilt slightly. Beautiful. Had he actually called her beautiful? She opened her mouth to protest, to tell him he must need spectacles, but the look in his eyes stopped her. He meant it. Somehow, impossibly, this handsome cowboy meant every word he said. I thought you'd be disappointed, she confessed, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. I thought you'd take one look at me and realize you made a mistake. Kenneth's expression softened, and this time he did touch her, his hand gentle on her elbow. The only mistake would be letting you get back on that train. Come on, let's get you out of this sun. You must be exhausted from your journey. He picked up her carpet bag as though it weighed nothing and guided her toward a wagon waiting at the edge of the platform. Eleanor walked beside him in a daze, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. He hadn't rejected her. He had called her beautiful. He seemed genuinely happy that she was here. It was so far from what she had expected that she couldn't quite believe it was real. The wagon was simple but well maintained, with 2 sturdy horses hitched to the front. Kenneth helped her up onto the seat with a gentleness that surprised her, his hands strong and steady at her waist. Then he climbed up beside her, and they set off down the main street of Stillwater. The town was small, just a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a dusty central road. Eleanor saw a general store, a saloon, a church with a white steeple, and a hotel that looked like it might have 6 rooms at most. People stopped what they were doing to watch them pass, and Eleanor felt their eyes on her like brands. Kenneth seemed oblivious to the attention, his focus entirely on her. The ranch is about 5 miles outside of town, he said, guiding the horses with practiced ease. It's not much, but it's home. 300 acres, mostly grazing land. I run about 200 head of cattle, and I've got a few horses. The house is small, just 3 rooms, but it's solid. Built it myself 5 years ago when I first claimed the land. Eleanor nodded, trying to imagine what her new life would look like. 3 rooms, cattle. Wide open spaces as far as the eye could see. It was so different from the cramped, noisy streets of Boston that she felt a flutter of panic in her chest. You're scared, Kenneth observed, and there was no judgment in his voice, only understanding. Is it that obvious? Eleanor asked with a weak laugh. You're gripping the seat like you think the wagon might fly apart, he said, and now there was a hint of amusement in his tone. Eleanor, I want you to know that you can be honest with me. If you're having second thoughts, if you want to go back, I'll buy you a ticket myself. I won't force you into anything you don't want. Eleanor looked at him, really looked at him, and saw sincerity in every line of his face. He meant it. He would let her go if she asked. But where would she go? Back to Boston, where she had nothing and no one. To another city where she would struggle to find work and lodging. At least here with Kenneth, she had a chance at something better. And there was something about him, something in the way he looked at her and spoke to her, that made her want to stay. I'm not having second thoughts, she said firmly. I'm just nervous. This is all so new and I don't know what I'm doing, but I want to try. I want to make this work." Kenneth's face broke into a smile that transformed his features, making him look younger and even more handsome. "That's all I can ask for," he said. "We'll figure it out together." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the wagon rattling over the uneven road. The landscape around them was breathtaking in its stark beauty. Rolling grassland stretched to the horizon, dotted with scrub brush and the occasional tree. The sky was impossibly large, a dome of brilliant blue that seemed to go on forever. Eleanor had never seen so much space, so much emptiness. It should have been frightening, but instead she felt something unexpected: freedom. Here there were no narrow alleys, no judgmental neighbors, no suffocating tenements. Here there was room to breathe. "Tell me about yourself," Kenneth said after a while. "I know what you wrote in your letters, but I want to hear your voice. I want to know the real Eleanor Vance." Eleanor hesitated. In her letters, she had been careful to present herself in the best possible light, emphasizing her good qualities and glossing over her failures. But Kenneth had asked for honesty, and something about the way he looked at her made her want to give it to him. "I'm not a very good cook," she admitted. "My mother tried to teach me, but I was always more interested in books than recipes. I can make a passable stew, but don't expect anything fancy." "I can teach you," Kenneth said easily. "I've been cooking for myself for 5 years. I know my way around a kitchen. I've never been on a ranch before. I've never even touched a cow. They're gentler than they look, most of them. I'll introduce you slowly. I'm afraid of horses." Kenneth glanced at her with surprise. "You're afraid of horses? How did you manage the journey here?" "I closed my eyes a lot during the stagecoach portions," Eleanor confessed, and Kenneth laughed, a rich, warm sound that made her smile despite her embarrassment. "Well, we'll have to work on that," he said. "But there's no rush. You can take your time getting used to ranch life." Eleanor felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. "You're being very patient with me." "You left everything you knew to come here," Kenneth said, his voice suddenly serious. "That took courage. The least I can do is be patient while you adjust." They crested a small hill and Kenneth pointed ahead. "There it is, home." Eleanor looked and saw a small wooden house nestled in a valley, surrounded by fenced pastures. It was simple, with a peaked roof and a front porch, but it looked solid and well cared for. Behind the house was a barn, and beyond that, she could see cattle grazing in the distance. Smoke rose from the chimney, which struck her as odd on such a hot day. "My neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, offered to come by and make sure the house was ready for you," Kenneth explained, seeing her confusion. "She's probably got something cooking for dinner. She's been excited about your arrival. The whole town has, actually. We don't get many new people out here." Eleanor's stomach clenched with nervousness. "What did you tell them about me?" "Just that I'd been corresponding with a woman from Boston, and that you were coming to be my wife. People are curious, but they're good folks. They'll welcome you." As they drew closer to the house, the front door opened and a plump woman in her 50s emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. Her face was friendly and open, with rosy cheeks and kind eyes. "There you are," she called out. "I was starting to think that train was late. Come in, come in. Dinner's almost ready." Kenneth helped Eleanor down from the wagon, and she found herself being swept into the house by Mrs. Patterson's enthusiastic chatter. The interior was neat and sparsely furnished, with a main room that served as both kitchen and living area, and 2 doors that presumably led to the other rooms. Everything was clean but clearly masculine, lacking the small touches that would make it a home. Eleanor could see where she might add curtains, maybe a tablecloth, some flowers in a vase. The thought surprised her. She was already thinking of this place as home. "You must be exhausted, dear," Mrs. Patterson said, guiding Eleanor to a chair at the rough wooden table. That journey from Boston, my goodness. I went to St. Louis once and that was far enough for me. Sit, sit. I've made a pot roast. Nothing fancy, but it'll stick to your ribs. Kenneth stood awkwardly by the door, and Eleanor realized he was as nervous as she was. This was strange for both of them, this sudden intimacy with a stranger. But Mrs. Patterson's presence helped, her cheerful chatter filling the awkward silences as she bustled around the kitchen. Over dinner, Eleanor learned more about Stillwater and the surrounding area. Mrs. Patterson's husband ran the general store, and they had 3 grown children who had all moved to bigger towns. Kenneth's ranch was one of several in the area, though his was among the more successful. He had a reputation for being honest and hardworking, and people respected him. Eleanor listened and watched Kenneth's face as Mrs. Patterson talked, seeing the way he ducked his head when she praised him, the slight color that rose in his cheeks. He was humble, she realized. Despite his success, despite his obvious strength and capability, he didn't think too highly of himself. When the meal was finished, Mrs. Patterson gathered her things and prepared to leave. "I'll come by tomorrow if that's all right," she said to Eleanor. "I thought I might help you settle in, show you around a bit." "That would be lovely, thank you," Eleanor said, genuinely grateful. After Mrs. Patterson left, the house fell into silence. Eleanor stood by the table, unsure what to do or say. Kenneth seemed equally uncertain, running his hand through his hair and looking everywhere but at her. "So," he finally said, "we should probably talk about sleeping arrangements." Eleanor felt her face flame. In all her worrying about Kenneth rejecting her, she hadn't given much thought to the practical realities of their situation. They were supposed to be married, but they barely knew each other. "I'll take the other room," Kenneth said quickly. "You can have my bedroom. It's the bigger of the two and it has a proper bed. I'll be fine on the cot in the spare room." "That doesn't seem fair," Eleanor protested. "It's your house." "And you're my guest until we figure things out," Kenneth said firmly. "Eleanor, I meant what I said earlier. I won't force anything on you. We can take our time getting to know each other. There's no rush." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, but for the first time they were tears of relief rather than fear. "Thank you," she whispered. Kenneth showed her to his bedroom, which was indeed larger than she expected. The bed was handmade but sturdy, covered with a colorful quilt that must have been a gift from some well-meaning neighbor. There was a chest of drawers, a washstand with a basin and pitcher, and a window that looked out over the pastures. It was simple but clean, and Eleanor felt her exhaustion catch up with her all at once. "I'll leave you to rest," Kenneth said from the doorway. "There's water in the pitcher and towels in the top drawer. If you need anything at all, I'll be right in the next room." After he left, closing the door softly behind him, Eleanor sank onto the bed and let out a long breath. This was her life now. This room, this house, this man. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. She unpacked her few belongings, hanging her 2 other dresses on pegs by the door and arranging her hairbrush and the small photograph of her mother on the chest of drawers. Then she changed into her nightgown and crawled under the quilt, her body aching from the long journey. But sleep didn't come easily. She lay in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch. Crickets chirped outside the window. Cattle lowed in the distance. She heard Kenneth moving around in the other room, the creak of floorboards under his weight. She wondered what he was thinking, whether he was having second thoughts now that he'd had time to really look at her. But then she remembered the way he had looked at her on the platform, the sincerity in his voice when he said he'd been waiting his whole life. Maybe, just maybe, this could work. The next morning, Eleanor woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. For a moment, she was disoriented, unsure where she was. Then memory flooded back and she sat up quickly, smoothing her hair and looking around for her dress. The sun was already well up, streaming through the window in golden shafts. She had slept later than she intended, exhausted from her journey. She dressed quickly and emerged from the bedroom to find Kenneth at the stove, expertly flipping bacon in a cast iron skillet. He had already been out to do morning chores, she realized, seeing the dirt on his boots and the fresh air that clung to him. "Good morning," he said, glancing over his shoulder with a smile. "I hope I didn't wake you. I tried to be quiet, but I'm not used to having someone else in the house." "You didn't wake me," Eleanor assured him. "I should have been up earlier. I didn't mean to sleep so late." "You needed the rest," Kenneth said. "Sit down. Breakfast is almost ready." Eleanor sat and watched him work, impressed by his competence in the kitchen. He moved with the same easy confidence he had shown with the horses and wagon, comfortable in his own skin. When he set a plate before her, piled high with bacon, eggs, and fresh biscuits, she realized she was starving. "You really can cook," she said, taking a bite of biscuit that practically melted in her mouth. "I had to learn," Kenneth said with a shrug. "It was either that or starve, but I'll be honest, I'm looking forward to having help with it. Cooking for one gets old after a while." They ate in companionable silence, and Eleanor found herself relaxing. This wasn't so hard. Kenneth was kind and patient, and he didn't seem to expect her to be anything other than herself. Maybe this arrangement could work after all. After breakfast, Kenneth gave her a proper tour of the property. He walked slowly, mindful of her long skirts and city boots, pointing out the various buildings and explaining how the ranch operated. The barn held half a dozen horses, including a gentle mare named Daisy that Kenneth said would be perfect for Eleanor to learn on. The chicken coop behind the house provided eggs, and there was a small vegetable garden that had been neglected but could be revived. The cattle ranged over the pastures, moved from place to place to ensure good grazing. Kenneth employed 2 ranch hands who came in during the day to help with the heavy work, but mostly he managed on his own. "It's a lot of work," he admitted. "But it's mine, you know. I built this from nothing. When I came to Oklahoma 5 years ago, I had a horse, a saddle, and $20 to my name. Everything else I earned." "Where did you come from originally?" Eleanor asked, realizing how little she actually knew about his past. "Kansas," Kenneth said. "My father had a farm there. But when he died, the land went to my older brother, as is the custom. I could have stayed on and worked for him, but I wanted something of my own. So I came here, claimed this land, and started over." "You miss your family?" Kenneth considered the question. "Sometimes. I've got 3 brothers and 2 sisters, all older than me. We write occasionally, but I don't see them much. This is my life now." Eleanor understood that feeling, the sense of being cut off from your past, of starting fresh in a new place. "I don't have any siblings," she said softly. "It was just me and my mother, and now it's just me." Kenneth stopped walking and turned to face her. "It doesn't have to be just you anymore," he said. "That's why you're here, isn't it? So neither of us has to be alone." Eleanor met his eyes and saw hope there and vulnerability. He was taking as much of a risk as she realized. He was opening his home and his heart to a stranger, trusting that it would work out. The least she could do was trust him in return. "Yes," she said simply. "That's why I'm here." Mrs. Patterson arrived mid-morning as promised, bringing fresh bread and a cheerful energy that filled the small house. She took Eleanor under her wing, showing her where things were kept, explaining how the stove worked, and sharing tips for managing a frontier household. Eleanor tried to absorb it all, but it was overwhelming. There was so much she didn't know, so many skills she lacked. "Don't worry, dear," Mrs. Patterson said, patting her hand. "You'll learn. We all had to learn when we came out here. Nobody's born knowing how to live on the frontier." Over the next few days, Eleanor settled into a routine. She woke early, helped Kenneth with breakfast, and spent her mornings learning the basics of running the household. Mrs. Patterson came by often, patient and encouraging as Eleanor fumbled her way through baking bread, doing laundry in the big tub out back, and tending the vegetable garden. In the afternoons, Kenneth would take time from his work to teach her about the ranch. He introduced her to each of the horses, letting her get comfortable with their size and smell before attempting to ride. He showed her how to collect eggs from the chickens without getting pecked, and how to tell if the cattle were healthy just by watching how they moved. Eleanor discovered that she enjoyed the work once she got over her initial fear. There was something satisfying about kneading bread dough, about seeing the garden come back to life under her care, about gathering warm eggs from the nests, and she loved spending time with Kenneth. He was endlessly patient with her mistakes, quick to laugh at himself when things went wrong, and generous with his praise when she got something right. She found herself watching him when he wasn't looking, admiring the way his muscles moved under his shirt when he worked, the concentration on his face when he was fixing something, the gentle way he handled the animals. 2 weeks after her arrival, Kenneth suggested they go into town for church and to pick up supplies. Eleanor was nervous about facing the townspeople, but she agreed. She wore her best dress, the one she had saved for special occasions, and pinned her hair up carefully. When she emerged from the bedroom, Kenneth's eyes widened. "You look beautiful," he said, and there was that sincerity again, that genuine appreciation that made her blush. "It's just an old dress," she protested. "It's not the dress," Kenneth said, stepping closer. "It's you." The ride into town was pleasant, the morning air still cool before the heat of the day set in. Kenneth pointed out various landmarks, told her stories about the early days of Stillwater, and made her laugh with anecdotes about his first disastrous attempts at ranching. By the time they arrived at the church, a small white building with a bell tower, Eleanor felt more relaxed than she had since arriving in Oklahoma. The church was nearly full, and conversations died down as Eleanor and Kenneth entered. She felt the weight of dozens of curious stares and instinctively moved closer to Kenneth. He seemed to sense her discomfort and placed his hand on the small of her back, a gesture of support and protection that steadied her. They found a seat near the back, and gradually the chatter resumed. Several people came over to introduce themselves. The Johnsons who ran the hotel, the Millers who had the ranch to the north, the Reverend Caldwell and his wife. Everyone was friendly, if a bit nosy, asking Eleanor about her journey and her impressions of Oklahoma. She answered as best she could, aware that she was being evaluated, that these people were deciding whether she was good enough for their Kenneth. After the service, there was a social on the church lawn, with tables of food and groups of people talking and laughing in the shade. Kenneth stayed close to Eleanor, making sure she was introduced around, including her in conversations. She met other ranch wives who shared tips on coping with the isolation and the work. She met shopkeepers and farmers and cowhands, all of them part of the small community that made up Stillwater. By the end of the afternoon, she felt less like an outsider and more like she might actually belong here. On the ride home, Eleanor was quiet, processing everything she had experienced. Kenneth glanced at her several times, as if wanting to say something but unsure how to begin. "What are you thinking?" he finally asked. Eleanor considered her answer carefully. "I'm thinking that this place, these people, they could really be my home if I let them." "And are you going to let them?" Kenneth asked softly. "I think so," Eleanor said. "I think I'd like to try." Kenneth smiled, and there was relief in his expression. "I'm glad, because I've been thinking too. We've been living under the same roof for 2 weeks now, and it's been good, better than good. But we're not married yet, and people are starting to talk." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. What are you saying? I'm saying that I'd like to make this official if you're willing. We could ask Reverend Caldwell to marry us maybe next Sunday, unless you want a big wedding, in which case we could wait and plan something. I don't need a big wedding, Eleanor said quickly. I don't have any family to invite anyway. But Kenneth, are you sure? It's only been 2 weeks. What if you change your mind? Kenneth pulled the wagon to a stop and turned to face her fully. Eleanor, I'm not going to change my mind. Every day I spend with you, I'm more certain that you're exactly who I need. You're smart and brave, and you make me laugh. You're learning to love this place the way I do, and I'm falling in love with you. Eleanor's breath caught. You are. Yes, Kenneth said simply. I know it's fast, and I know we're still getting to know each other. But I don't need more time to know how I feel. I love you, Eleanor Vance. And I want you to be my wife, really and truly, not just on paper. Tears spilled down Eleanor's cheeks, but for once they were happy tears. I love you too, she whispered. I didn't think I could feel this way, not so quickly, but I do. I love you, Kenneth Owens. Kenneth reached out and cupped her face in his hands, wiping away her tears with his thumbs. Can I kiss you? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. Yes, Eleanor breathed, and then his lips were on hers, gentle and sweet and full of promise. It was Eleanor's first kiss, and it was everything she had dreamed a kiss could be. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. They were married the following Sunday in a simple ceremony at the church, with most of the town in attendance. Eleanor wore a new dress that Mrs. Patterson had helped her make, a soft blue that brought out her eyes. Kenneth wore his best suit, his hair slicked back and his boots polished. As they stood before Reverend Caldwell and exchanged vows, Eleanor felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This was where she was meant to be. This was the life she was meant to have. The wedding night was awkward and sweet and tender, both of them nervous and eager and determined to make each other happy. Kenneth was patient, taking his time, making sure Eleanor felt safe and loved. And when she finally fell asleep in his arms, her head on his chest and his hand in her hair, she felt a contentment she had never known before. The weeks turned into months, and Eleanor bloomed in her new life. She gained weight, her cheeks filling out and her body growing stronger from the physical work. Her skills improved under Mrs. Patterson's tutelage, and she discovered a talent for gardening that resulted in a thriving vegetable patch and flower beds around the house. She learned to ride Daisy, tentatively at first and then with growing confidence, until she could ride out to check on the cattle with Kenneth. She made friends with the other ranch wives, joining their quilting circle and sharing recipes and gossip. But the best part of her new life was Kenneth. He was everything she could have hoped for in a husband: kind, hardworking, affectionate, and devoted. He brought her wildflowers from the pastures and made her laugh with his terrible jokes. He held her when she had nightmares about being back in Boston, cold and alone and hungry. He told her every day that he loved her, and showed her in 100 small ways, from the way he saved her the best piece of meat at dinner to the way he listened when she talked about her mother. They had been married for 4 months when Eleanor realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but she waited until she was sure before telling Kenneth. She chose a quiet evening after dinner, when they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Kenneth, she said, her heart pounding. I have something to tell you. He turned to her immediately, always attentive to her tone. What is it? Is something wrong? No, nothing's wrong, Eleanor said quickly. In fact, something's very right. Kenneth, we're going to have a baby. For a moment, Kenneth just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then his face broke into the biggest smile Eleanor had ever seen, and he let out a whoop of joy that probably carried all the way to town. He scooped her up and spun her around, then set her down carefully as if she might break. "A baby," he said, his voice full of wonder. "Eleanor, we're going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" she asked, even though she could see the answer in his face. "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it," Kenneth said, pulling her close. "You've given me everything, Eleanor. A home, a family, a reason to work this hard every day. I never thought I could be this lucky." "I'm the lucky one," Eleanor said, resting her head against his chest and listening to the steady beat of his heart. "You saved me, Kenneth. I was lost and alone, and you gave me a place to belong." They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, watching the sun sink below the horizon. The future stretched before them, full of promise and possibility. Eleanor's pregnancy progressed smoothly, though the winter months were harder than she expected. Oklahoma winters could be brutal, with icy winds that cut through clothing and occasional snowstorms that left them housebound for days. But the house was snug and well built, and Kenneth had stockpiled plenty of firewood and supplies. They spent long evenings by the fire, Kenneth reading aloud from books borrowed from the Reverend's small library, while Eleanor knitted tiny socks and gowns for the baby. Mrs. Patterson and the other ranch wives rallied around Eleanor, sharing advice and hand-me-down baby clothes. There was no doctor in Stillwater, but Mrs. Patterson had delivered dozens of babies over the years and promised to be there when Eleanor's time came. Kenneth fretted and worried, becoming overprotective as Eleanor's belly swelled. He barely let her lift anything heavier than a teacup, and he checked on her constantly when he was working around the ranch. "I'm not made of glass," Eleanor protested one day when he insisted on carrying a basket of laundry for her. "I know," Kenneth said. "But you're carrying something precious, and I'm not taking any chances." Eleanor rolled her eyes but couldn't help smiling. His devotion was endearing, even when it was excessive. The baby came on a warm April evening in 1884, just as the wildflowers were starting to bloom across the prairie. Eleanor's labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when she thought she couldn't go on. But Kenneth stayed by her side the whole time, holding her hand and wiping her forehead and telling her how brave she was. Mrs. Patterson worked efficiently, her calm presence a steadying force. And finally, as the sun was setting, Eleanor heard the most beautiful sound in the world, her baby's first cry. "It's a boy," Mrs. Patterson announced, placing the squirming, red-faced infant in Eleanor's arms. "A big, healthy boy." Eleanor looked down at her son, at his tiny fingers and his shock of dark hair and his eyes that seemed to look right into her soul, and felt a love so fierce it took her breath away. Kenneth leaned over them both, tears streaming down his face, and touched the baby's cheek with one gentle finger. "He's perfect," Kenneth whispered. "Eleanor, he's perfect." They named him Thomas after Eleanor's father who had died when she was young. Thomas Owens was a good baby, content and healthy, with his father's gray eyes and his mother's serious expression. Kenneth was besotted, spending every free moment with his son, rocking him and singing off-key lullabies and just watching him sleep with an expression of pure wonder. Life fell into a new rhythm, busier and more chaotic with a baby in the house, but richer too. Eleanor had never been so tired or so happy. She loved watching Kenneth with Thomas, seeing the gentle way he handled the tiny infant, the pride that shone in his face whenever anyone admired his son. The ranch continued to prosper, and Kenneth hired another hand to help with the work so he could spend more time with his family. When Thomas was 6 months old, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant again. Kenneth's reaction was the same explosive joy, tempered this time with concern for Eleanor's health. But Eleanor felt stronger now, more capable and confident. She had survived childbirth once, she could do it again. Their daughter, Emma, was born in February of 1885, a tiny thing with blonde hair and blue eyes that gradually shifted to green. Thomas was fascinated by his baby sister, toddling over to her cradle constantly to check on her. The years passed in a blur of children and cattle, and the endless work of running a ranch. Thomas grew into a sturdy, serious boy who followed his father everywhere, learning the ways of horses and cattle almost before he could read. Emma was bright and curious, asking endless questions and always getting into mischief. 2 more children followed, a son they named Robert in 1887 and another daughter, Alice, in 1889. The small house that had once seemed adequate became cramped with 4 children and all their noise and energy. Kenneth and his hired hands built an addition, adding 2 more bedrooms and expanding the kitchen. Eleanor planted more flowers and vegetables, keeping chickens and even a milk cow. The ranch grew along with the family, eventually encompassing 500 acres and 300 head of cattle. Kenneth's reputation as a fair and honest rancher spread, and he was elected to the town council, helping to make decisions that shaped Stillwater's future. Through it all, through the hard times and the good times, through droughts and illnesses and the occasional dispute with neighbors, Kenneth and Eleanor's love deepened and matured. They had built something real together, a family and a home and a legacy. The scared young woman who had stepped off the train expecting rejection was gone, replaced by a confident ranch wife and mother who knew her own strength. And the lonely cowboy who had placed an advertisement in a newspaper had found exactly what he was looking for, even if he hadn't known it at the time. One evening in the summer of 1895, Eleanor sat on the porch and watched the sun set, just as she had done countless times before. The children were inside, the older ones helping the younger ones get ready for bed. Kenneth emerged from the barn and walked toward the house, moving a bit slower than he had 12 years ago, but still strong and capable. He climbed the porch steps and settled into the chair beside her with a contented sigh. "Long day," he said, reaching over to take her hand. "Long but good," Eleanor agreed. She looked out at the land that had become so familiar, at the pastures dotted with cattle and the barn and the gardens and the flowers blooming in riotous color. She thought about the life they had built together, about their children growing strong and healthy, about the community they were part of. And she thought about that day 12 years ago when she had stepped off the train, certain she would be rejected. "What are you smiling about?" Kenneth asked, noticing her expression. "I was just remembering the day we met," Eleanor said. "How scared I was, how certain I was that you'd send me away." Kenneth squeezed her hand. "I told you that day that I'd been waiting my whole life for you. I meant it then and I mean it now." "Every day with you has been a gift, Eleanor, every single day." Eleanor leaned over and kissed him, a soft, sweet kiss that still made her heart flutter after all these years. "I love you, Kenneth Owens." "I love you too, Eleanor Owens. Always have, always will." They sat together in the gathering darkness, hands clasped, watching the stars begin to appear in the vast Oklahoma sky. Inside, their children's voices drifted out through the open windows, the sounds of laughter and arguments and the chaos of family life. This was home. This was happiness. This was everything Eleanor had never dared to dream of when she was cold and hungry and alone in Boston. She had taken a chance on a Cowboy's advertisement and a handful of hopeful letters. She had traveled halfway across the country to a place she had never seen, to marry a man she had never met. And somehow, impossibly, it had worked out better than she could have imagined. Kenneth had meant what he said that first day. He had been waiting his whole life for her. And she, though she hadn't known it at the time, had been waiting for him too. As the years continued to pass, the Owens family became a fixture in Stillwater. Thomas grew into a fine young man who took over more and more of the ranch work, showing the same dedication and skill his father had. He married a sweet girl from a neighboring ranch in 1903, and they built a house on the far side of the property. Emma surprised everyone by developing a passion for teaching and eventually became Stillwater's schoolteacher, educating a new generation of frontier children. Robert decided ranching wasn't for him and moved to Oklahoma City to study law, though he came home often for visits. Alice, the baby, stayed close to home, helping her mother and eventually marrying a young man who worked as Kenneth's foreman. Kenneth and Eleanor grew older together, their hair turning gray and their faces becoming lined with age, but their love never dimmed. They were still the couple that everyone in Stillwater pointed to as an example of what marriage should be. They still held hands when they walked. They still looked at each other with the same warmth and affection they had shown from the beginning. In 1910, when they had been married for 27 years, the town of Stillwater threw a celebration in their honor. It seemed half the territory turned out, filling the church and spilling out onto the lawn. People made speeches about Kenneth's contributions to the community and Eleanor's kindness and generosity. Their children and grandchildren, now numbering 8, surrounded them with love and laughter. As Eleanor stood beside her husband, overwhelmed by the outpouring of affection and respect, she thought again about that train platform in 1883. She thought about the frightened young woman she had been, convinced she would be rejected, certain she had made a terrible mistake. If she could go back and tell that young woman what lay ahead, she wouldn't believe it. The happiness, the love, the family, the respect of an entire community, it was more than Eleanor had ever thought possible. Kenneth must have sensed her thoughts because he leaned close and whispered, "No regrets." Eleanor smiled up at him, this man who had seen past her fears and insecurities to the person she could become. "Not a single one," she whispered back. "You gave me everything." "You gave me more," Kenneth insisted. "You gave me a life worth living." They stood together, surrounded by the fruits of their love and labor, and Eleanor felt a profound sense of peace. She had found her place in the world. She had found her purpose. And most importantly, she had found love with a cowboy who had been waiting his whole life, just for her. The celebration continued around them, but for a moment, Eleanor and Kenneth existed in their own private world, just the two of them as it had been in the beginning. And Eleanor knew, with absolute certainty, that if she had it all to do over again, the fear, the uncertainty, the risk of traveling to marry a stranger, she would make the same choice in a heartbeat. Because sometimes the greatest rewards come from the biggest leaps of faith. And sometimes, when you step off the train expecting rejection, you find instead a man who says, "I've been waiting my whole life," and means it with every fiber of his being. Kenneth passed away peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1918, at the age of 61. Eleanor was devastated by the loss of her partner, her best friend, the love of her life. But she was surrounded by her children and grandchildren, by the community they had helped build, and by 3 decades of beautiful memories. She lived another 12 years, staying in the house Kenneth had built, tending her gardens and watching her family grow. She told her grandchildren stories about their grandfather, about his kindness and his strength, and the way he had looked at her the first time they met. She told them about taking a chance on love, about believing in possibilities, about the magic that can happen when two people truly see each other. When Eleanor finally joined Kenneth in 1930, the town of Stillwater mourned the loss of one of its founding mothers. But they celebrated too, celebrating a life well lived and a love story that had become legend. The ranch stayed in the family, passed down through the generations, and the story of how Kenneth and Eleanor met became part of the family lore, told and retold at gatherings and holidays. And sometimes, on summer evenings, when the sun sets over the Oklahoma prairie in shades of gold and crimson, and the cattle low in the distance, and the wildflowers bloom across the grasslands, people say you can still feel their presence. The cowboy who waited his whole life, and the woman who stepped off the train expecting rejection, forever bound together by a love that transcended time, circumstance, and every obstacle in their path. They had built something lasting, something beautiful, something that proved that sometimes the best things in life come when you're brave enough to take a chance on the unknown. And that when love is real and true, when two hearts recognize each other despite all logic and reason, it can overcome anything, even fear, even doubt, even the vast distance between Boston and the Oklahoma frontier. Their love story became a beacon for others who doubted, who feared, who wondered if they too might find happiness in unexpected places. It reminded people that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. That sometimes the scariest decisions lead to the greatest joys. That a single moment of bravery, stepping off a train, speaking words of welcome instead of rejection, opening your heart to possibility, can change the entire trajectory of a life. The Owens family prospered for generations, each one carrying forward the legacy of Kenneth and Eleanor. They told their children about love and faith and taking chances. They taught them to see beyond surfaces, to value character over appearance, to understand that the most important things in life often come in unexpected packages. And they made sure that every new generation knew the story of how it all began. With a lonely cowboy placing an advertisement, a desperate woman responding, and two souls recognizing each other across the distance, waiting for the moment when they would finally meet. In the end, Kenneth and Eleanor's story wasn't just about romance, though there was plenty of that. It wasn't just about building a ranch or raising a family or contributing to a community, though they did all those things admirably. It was about transformation, about two people who were incomplete on their own becoming whole together, about finding courage in each other's presence, about building something meaningful from nothing but hope and hard work and an unwavering commitment to each other. It was about proving that love, real love, doesn't always announce itself with thunder and lightning. Sometimes it begins quietly with a simple statement, "I've been waiting my whole life." And sometimes, the person you've been waiting for is the one you least expect, arriving dusty and frightened and beautiful in ways that have nothing to do with physical appearance and everything to do with the strength of their spirit and the depth of their heart. Eleanor and Kenneth's love story lived on long after they were gone, a testament to the power of faith, the importance of kindness, and the extraordinary things that can happen when two people decide to trust each other enough to build a life together. It reminded everyone who heard it that happy endings are possible, that love can be found in the most unlikely circumstances, and that sometimes the best adventures begin with the simple act of stepping off a train and into the arms of someone who's been waiting for you all along.